Hello and welcome to this week's State of the Market update with the Sultan of Sonar, Zach Strickland. So I think this week's big news is obviously Hurricane Florence sitting out in the Atlantic Ocean. After having a very quiet August, we now have had our second hurricane form out in the Atlantic Basin. I guess Gordon really didn't form in the Atlantic Basin, but it made it through it. Ocean temperatures have been cooler than average. We also had very unfavorable wind patterns out in the ocean. So now they finally figured out a way to make it all the way through, which is not great news. But nevertheless, they are quite impactful systems, especially when they make landfall in the eastern United States. A lot of population there, so freight markets tend to fall apart rapidly as disaster relief shows up and sucks away capacity. And you can see that reflected here in the map that I have pulled up this week. What this is the inbound tender market share weekly change. So this is a good kind of measure of relative volume as the trucks move from different areas of the country. So inbound tender market share. So you see here that these white areas are showing that we have had decreased inbound tender market share, or inbound volume per se. What that's telling us is that carriers are less likely to have a truck moving into this area in anticipation of the flooding rains and high winds and all that, as the system is expected to dump significant amounts of water over this region. What I would expect to see is people kind of building up, positioning their fleets a little bit maybe in anticipation as FEMA starts talking to people, but we won't see tender rejections or anything kind of fall apart with any significance until the storm actually hits and destabilizes the market in general. That's what happened with Hurricane Harvey last year. It didn't suck away the capacity right away. What you saw was this kind of delayed impact as disaster relief got in there and evaluated the situation, brought in, there's obviously a big stockpile of waters and other supplies that people are going to need for just to get through the process of evaluation. And then once they figure out and assess all the damages, trucks start moving in there with all the supplies and rebuilding materials. So these aren't massive population centers up here where the flooding rains are supposed to hit, but Charlotte is certainly a big market. We can click on here and just kind of get an idea of what kind of market share or how much trucking volume in the country this market represents. Right here you can see the inbound tender market share is 2.1% of the overall trucking market. So that's a pretty decent chunk of the market. The biggest freight market in the country in terms of outbound is Atlanta. Inbound also is pretty big. It's 4.46%. So 2.1% is a pretty significant freight market to disrupt. Wilmington, where the hurricane is supposed to hit, you can see here it is not a very big market. 0.16% of the overall freight flow. Again, there's a big region of not a densely populated area. So really what I'm expecting to see is here in the next couple of weeks, this area kind of start heating up with, it's going to start sucking up capacity depending on the level of damage and how quickly the storm kind of moves through. We've already had a lot of significant flooding up in this area over here. If they start getting involved as well, you're going to see freight markets destabilize very quickly as people try to rebuild this area quickly. So the rest of the country, however, as we await Florence's impact, the freight market itself, outbound tender rejections in the country right now, very, very moderate. We're calling this the new normal. What's happened is, capacities kind of come online incrementally, kind of putting some stabilizing pressure on rates. We have seen a little bit more activity over the last couple of weeks as we start to kind of figure out if this is going to be a big ramp-up session. September is kind of a swing month. There is one market, however, that we've been talking about that just seems to want to behave a little differently than the rest of the country, and that's Chicago. Chicago tender rejections are starting to go up again. They've been kind of acting in opposition to the rest of the country starting in mid-July. And as I compare them to the tender rejection index in the United States, You're going to see that illustrated here. There's a big alligator mouth right here. Chicago still kind of fighting, and it's because they've got a lot of intermodal presence in that market. So I have seen the rate pressure stay kind of elevated as it relates to the rest of the country. Again, moving into the next couple of weeks, I think this is going to be a big month for capacity restraints, especially if we have two other hurricanes sitting out in the Atlantic. These are very large black swan events that can destabilize the market quickly. So please stay tuned to FreightWaves for any further market updates. Thank you.